Hi and welcome to Viewmaster Travels. Today we're looking at reel number 162, the Overseas Highway in Key West. There's not really a lot of representation for Key West in my Viewmaster collection, but it's a place I've wanted to visit for many years, especially one amazing place way off the coast, so let's get started. Key West is way down here, quite a way south of Florida. It's the westernmost island in a chain of islands called the Florida Keys, and getting there is quite a task. We rented a car in Miami and headed south along Route 1, leaving the mainland on a narrow set of bridges, one of which was actually the first Viewmaster picture we were looking for. 7 Mile Bridge. The 7 Mile Bridge is just one of many bridges that connect all these little islands together. The bridges are narrow and run just above the water, and they're the only way to drive the 100 miles or so to Key West. The bridges seem impossible, super long and straight and barely above the water, so I wondered how they got built in the first place. Originally, the Keys could only be reached by sea, and for hundreds of years were quite the hub of piracy, until Florida became a U.S. territory in 1822, and the U.S. Navy kicked all the pirates out. Then, after the Civil War, Henry Flagler, who with his partner John D. Rockefeller had become quite wealthy monopolizing the oil industry, decided to build a train line south along the coast of Florida, from Jacksonville to St. Augustine, then to Miami and points south. Flagler is responsible for creating or developing almost all the East Coast cities in Florida. In 1905, with the announcement of the construction of the Panama Canal, Flagler realized that Key West would be the closest U.S. port to the new canal, so he decided to extend his coastal railroad to connect the remote island to the rest of the country. It was the kind of ambitious project you just don't see anymore these days. One super rich guy just decided to build hundreds of miles of bridges and railroad through hostile environments just to get to the edge of the map. He employed 4,000 people and set up 82 work camps for them. 3 separate hurricanes destroyed much of their progress and killed 250 of his workers over the years. But 7 years later, just a couple weeks after his 82nd birthday, Flagler got to ride his private rail car all the way to Key West. And after all that work, the railroad wasn't really very successful. And in 1935, another hurricane hit, this one a really big one, destroying 40 miles of track and killing over 400 people. The railroad couldn't recover, and the infrastructure was sold to the state of Florida, who adapted it for car traffic. To convert it for cars, they just built a concrete road right over the railroad and widened it with steel beams. They pulled up the old tracks and used them for guardrails. They finished in 1938, allowing for the first time people to drive all the way to Key West. Eventually, these new bridges were also damaged by hurricanes, and in the late 70s, entirely new bridges were built right next to the old ones. Today, as you drive along the new bridges, you can see the remains of the old railroad bridges next to you, and I'd assume as you zipped by, you'd have no idea how one man's vision and hundreds of lost lives let you drive out into the ocean to Key West. And after we finally made it into Old Town, we set out on foot in search of our next goal. Sloppy Joe's Bar, Key West. I found online this tourist map from 1941, which would have been right around when the Viewmaster pictures were taken, and also this bird's eye map from 1884, so I thought it would be fun to mark the places we went on both maps. Sloppy Joe's is here on the northwest side of Key West, on the famous Duval Street, which runs all the way from one side to the other. The west half of the island is Old Town and has a really interesting miniaturized southern feel mixed with Caribbean tropics. Just walking around, you can tell you've reached somewhere special. The The entire old section of town is listed on the Registry of Historic Places, and it's full of interesting old homes, many built by the shipmakers who sailed through the region using shipbuilding techniques and furnished their homes with salvaged items. Key West hit really hard times during the Depression, and many of these homes were abandoned, but the city couldn't afford to demolish them, ironically preserving them. Sloppy Joe's itself has been on this corner since 1937, but before that the building was a restaurant called Victoria's, and parts of that have been there since 1892. The bar itself is most famous for one of its patrons, Ernest Hemingway, who lived on the island through the 30s and hung out with his writer friends. It was Hemingway who convinced the bar's owner, Joe Russell, to name it Sloppy Joe's. Russell was a rum runner during Prohibition, smuggling rum from Cuba to his speakeasy, named the Blind Pig at the time, and Hemingway was his fishing partner. Hemingway told Russell his bar floor was sloppy, so they named it Sloppy Joe's. They do sell Sloppy Joe sandwiches there, but the bar isn't named after them. I think Joe Russell got them from one of his other favorite bars, also called Sloppy Joe's, over in Havana. After eating our Sloppy Joe's in Sloppy Joe's, we headed along Duval Street to the south side of the island, looking to find another one of those houses making a crazy claim. This time it's the southernmost house in the U.S. As opposed to some of the oldest houses in the US we've seen, the southernmost house in the continental US pretty much is what it claims, especially when it was built in 1897. It was built by local judge Jephthah Vining Harris, whose wife was a local millionaire and who would eventually invest in Henry Flagler's railway to Key West. It actually only had one bedroom, but it was the first house in town to have electricity, actually installed by Thomas Edison himself. Over the years, it was a speakeasy and a nightclub and then a private residence, and in the mid-90s it was converted to a hotel, which is what it is today. Next to the house is another Key West landmark, the southernmost point in the continental U.S., the self-proclaimed most famous photographed place in Florida. This one I think's funny. It's not actually the southernmost point on the island, that's over here on the military base, and it's not actually a giant buoy. It's a concrete sewer junction that was buried under the road, and the street workers thought it was too big to haul away, so they left it on the corner, and then someone painted it Southernmost Point. What a crazy world we live in. The concrete marker's been there now for 40 years. People line up for hours to get a selfie next to it. It's got its own webcam, and the locals celebrate its birthday each year. I think there is something to the extreme edges of the map, like Flagler and his railway. You just can't go any further than this. One thing I did think about, though, was the Viewmaster pictures. There's a much more famous house on Key West, Hemingway's house, the house he lived in and owned for 30 years. Why isn't there a picture of that on the reel? Well, when the Viewmaster pictures were taken, it was still his private home. Although by then he'd moved to Havana, he still owned the house. It didn't become a museum until the mid-60s, and now it's the most popular attraction in Key West. And our last goal was a bit of a distance away on the other side of the island. Old Fortress East Martello Tower. This small brick fort is part of a series of forts intended to protect the island and the Gulf, built before the Civil War, soon after Florida became a territory of the United States. Of the 3 forts on the island, this east one was built last, in 1862, although work was suspended 4 years later and it was never completed. It was only used a little after that and considered surplus in 1944, and I assume basically abandoned. It was leased to the Key West Historical Society in 1950 and opened as a museum. There's a good chance when the Viewmaster pictures were taken that it was still abandoned. And what's interesting is that I couldn't match the picture properly because the Key West airports expanded right up against the tower property. The Viewmaster photographer was standing where the parking garage is now. There's a West Martello Tower as well. That one's now a garden club and kind of obscured. And west of that's the larger Fort Zachary Taylor, which is part of the active military base and well worth exploring. But the granddaddy of them all, even further west than that, is one of the most amazing places I think I've ever been to. It's not on the Viewmaster reel, but was a place we'd been wanting to see for years, so we got up early and rode the ferry to the Dry Tortugas. Islands dry because there's no fresh water, and tortugas because they look like turtles. Over 2 hours of rough seas and seasickness later, this immense brick structure came into view just above the waterline. This is Fort Jefferson, 70 miles west of Key West. It's the largest and most remote mega fort ever built in the 19th century. The ferry docked and it took a bit for the ground to stop moving, but after that we started to explore. It's a mammoth 6-sided fort that was to hold 450 cannons in 3 tiers towering 50 feet above the water and would house 1,500 soldiers. Construction started in 1847 using slaves from Key West and ended in 1875, although gave up might be a better term since it was never completed. Its history is full of disaster and strife. It was hit by hurricanes, money and supply shortages, disease and yellow fever, and was obsolete before it was ever finished. There's so much to see on this little island exploring this huge area. Here's just a few facts. You can see the different colored bricks in the walls. The lower bricks came from Florida, but since the fort stayed with the Union, they couldn't get bricks from Florida during the Civil War. So in order to finish the wall, they had to ship these darker bricks all the way from New York by ship. And after the Civil War, it became a prison and housed several of Lincoln's assassination conspirators, including Dr. Samuel Mudd, who'd helped John Wilkes Booth after he shot Lincoln. Mudd was arrested and imprisoned in the fort, but while a prisoner, he helped save the lives of many prisoners who got yellow fever, and he was later pardoned. And there's so little fresh water on the island that prisoners would carve little channels into the ground to try and collect rainwater in puddles to drink, and those channels are still there today. You can explore the ruins of the fort freely, at least until the ferry's ready to go, although you can arrange to spend the night there camping. But after spending the entire day there, we had to get back. And that's it for our trip to Key West. The Viewmaster reel doesn't really show much of the island. I think because the island really matured as a tourist destination decades after these pictures were taken. But today there's plenty to see and do, and it's a really exotic location to visit if you can. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching.